I've already mentioned we're here to talk about how to financially support your employees through fertility treatment. Don't worry if you can't read that little disclaimer or that note at the very bottom of the slide. That is just a comment regarding language that we use. Obviously, here at Fertifa, we pride ourselves on being really inclusive and universal, and we do really take pride in working with our workplace clients to help them with that language as well. So when we talk about, for example, a man, we are talking about individuals who are assigned male at birth. And when we're referring to women, we're actually referring to women who are assigned female at birth as well. But as we're talking about fertility treatment, hopefully I'll remind myself as I go that we're not just talking about men or women. We're not just necessarily talking about heterosexual couples or individuals, singles. We're talking about anyone and everyone who might be considering a path to parenthood, whether that's through assisted reproductive technology or potentially adoption and surrogacy as well. So with all of that said, this is what I'm hoping to talk through today. So we'll go through brief introductions, some of which I've already gone into, talk about the financial burden of fertility treatments, and then the role of employers in considering fertility benefits, options then for employers. Something that we're quite proud to have released just in the last year or so, or half year, is the Fertifa payment plan, which is one option. I'll leave time for discussion and Q&A, of course, and then we'll hopefully do a quick wrap up. But before we get into all of that, I thought what might be useful is if I launch a poll. And so what we're looking for here is a couple of questions. The first one is whether or not any of you attending have had any employees already ask for financial support for fertility treatment. And then the second question is whether or not you've got budget in 2025 to do that. And with that established, I'll go on while people are taking time to answer the poll and sort of submit their answers to the next slide, which is my chance to sort of then give the quick run through of Fertifa again. Already mentioned that we're London-based. I promise you this is not a sales pitch, but just to give you the context and why we thought we'd host this conversation and why we get asked it so often. We are Europe's leading reproductive health benefits provider. That means we do offer education and awareness, but we also provide well-being support, access to diagnostics and treatment. And then we also do quite a bit with respect to financial support as well. We administer the reimbursement plan for more than half of our workplace clients. We've processed more than £5 million worth of reimbursements in the last couple of years alone. But as I mentioned, we have, of course, also a payment plan, which may or may not be also potentially applicable to the nearly half of our clients that don't have a financial allowance or a policy to reimburse. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk through for the next maybe 45 minutes or so. So I think that we've actually had 100% response rate. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. And it looks like if I end the poll and I can share the results with all of you, you'll see that for the first question, whether or not you've had employees asking for financial support today, whether that's for IVF or egg freezing or otherwise, more than half of you say actually you haven't. Just under 10%, so just under 1 in 10 of you, but about 8% have said you have. And about 38% of you, or about 40% of you, said you're not quite sure. So that's really interesting to us because we think that there's probably quite a bit of pent-up demand, or a lot of sort of questions at least of employers. And we certainly find with all of the inbound that we receive and all of the queries that we receive, a lot of employers have been asked either by their existing employees or potentially those they're looking to recruit and have join the talent pool, that are saying that maybe their previous company did, and so they're wondering what the policies are at the new company or the place that they are interviewing. The answers then to the second question were probably a little bit more split, or a little bit balanced, about whether or not individuals or all of you representing the companies that you're at have budget in 2025 to consider offering some sort of reimbursement allowance for your employee base. And so more than 40% of you aren't sure. Maybe some of you are individuals as opposed to, say, HR managers or HR directors that might be looking to implement a policy and are simply looking about what you might want to consider as an individual in your workplace. More than 40% of you, same number, then it said you actually don't have any budget to do that. And so I will have a few slides on the payment plan, which is just an example of an option that you can offer to still support financially your employees going through treatment. And then 15% of you say that you do. I realize now maybe a third question could have been for those that you do, whether or not then you've already got that in place, meaning if the budget that you have in 2025 is already being deployed or implemented, or if you're looking at how to do that. But thank you to all of you for answering those questions. That really helps me get a sense for what I should emphasize as I go through the slides that I've prepared. I will therefore talk about the reasons why we're being told, again, by our inbound, but also by the employees of our existing clients, why they'd like some sort of financial support, the forms that can take, and whether or not there are alternatives in terms of budget. So I'll stop sharing that poll and I'll go then on to the next slide. Actually, before I do that, I'll do a couple of housekeeping rules. Apologies, I didn't mention this off the top. I talked about our use of language, but I should have talked about housekeeping for this webinar itself as well. So this webinar is being recorded. Having said that, we are using Zoom webinars, so you're largely anonymous to one another. If you do want to put something in the webinar chat to me, I will see your name and or your initials. So just be mindful of that if you didn't want to be identifiable. Clearly, if people put questions in the chat for me to answer during the session, I won't be identifying you by name, but just bear in mind that I can see your name. And depending on whether or not you're comfortable with that when you ask the question, you can also use the Q&A function where you can choose to be wholly anonymous, even to me, for example, and I will try and take that as we go. So as I mentioned, it's being recorded. So not only should you be mindful about your name potentially being visible to me during the session, but then again, if I were to refer to it because this is being recorded, people might be watching it back later. And then the other points about the housekeeping are that I've got both the chat function and the chat box open where I can see if anyone wants to ping me a comment or use that chat function to chat to me. Just between you and myself. And then there's also the Q&A box that I've also got open where I would love to have you ask questions as we go, because it'll help me break up the monotony of listening to my own voice, and it'll make sure that what I'm talking about is relevant to you, or what I'm emphasizing should be even further emphasized, or maybe what I've glossed over, you want me to go back towards. But again, if you ask as we go and in context, I think that'll be really helpful, certainly to me, but also to others that are on the session. So moving along then. So why this matters. I think that if you are joining this, I would hope that even if you haven't had individuals asking you about necessarily financial support for their fertility treatment, you'll probably know that there's already more than 3 million, almost 4 million people in the UK today who are experiencing fertility challenges. Many of those obviously work at companies like yours, if not obviously yours. And so that does end up becoming a real drain on their productivity. It can be quite distracting, can be obviously very emotionally difficult. And then, of course, what we're here to talk about today is it also prevents a burden to them financially, which, of course, many people will associate to work and employment, since that is typically the primary source of their income. Additionally, almost a third of them, so just shy, 32% of people who do go through fertility treatment do often say in hindsight, they were prepared financially at all before they went through it. So I think what happens is we see certainly a lot of our patients or our workplace clients, employees, prepare themselves and steel themselves emotionally to make sure they've got, support around them, whether that's through a partner or through family or through friends of theirs, or however they want to get that support, and potentially from providers such as ourselves that are looking after their well-being support. They'll think about the timing of undergoing medical treatment, of a cycle, of testing, for example, and maybe they'll think about the cost, but they might not think about or be aware of how the costs can start to increase over time. And once they start their cycle, or once they realize that there might be add-ons, additional investigations, medications, and the like, and they'll realize that they really weren't prepared before they started undergoing treatment for that financial burden and the cost. So these are sort of just 2 data points. I won't spend the entire session talking about why this matters. We will try to talk about as many of the practical ways to address and to support people through the session, but this is just touching on some points that I think help drive it home. So before I go into more detail about the financial costs, the burden, and how to support that, I think most of you hopefully are already sort of well versed on this. But again, resources such as Fertifa or lots of other resources online can talk you through these as well. When I'm talking about fertility treatments, I am talking about assisted reproductive technology in this context. However, mostly because that's what we're usually asked about, I should say, and I want to emphasize again, that at Fertifa, we would also support other paths to parenthood, such as adoption and surrogacy, which also can incur meaningful costs, and for which we would, again, if we were being asked, we would encourage employers to consider if they want to think about an allowance or somehow supporting their employees through any path to parenthood. And actually, if it was a broader webinar, we'd talk about all of reproductive health and well-being support. So maybe even menopause, for example, or maybe even treatment for endometriosis or PCOS or fibroids or the like, or for men, testosterone decline as they are aging, or maybe perhaps erectile dysfunction and the like. There's no shortage of issues and challenges and journeys that individuals will undergo relating to their reproductive health. Clearly, we would have a view that supporting those employees through all of them would be really beneficial. And I'll have a couple of slides as to why and the benefits to an organization to considering that. But the topic for today is specifically assisted reproductive technology. It could apply, of course, to adoption and surrogacy, depending on some of the things I explained to you or some of the options that we go through. And then in the case of some of the costings and some of the examples or case studies that I'm going to share, what I'm typically talking about is either IVF, which is in vitro fertilization and a cycle for that, or IUI, which is intrauterine insemination, or egg, sperm, or embryo freezing. And then sometimes, of course, you need to consider extra medications or just ongoing monitoring, either preparation of coming off some other medication, for example, before someone can undergo treatment, or while they're preparing for it, or afterwards. And so when we talk about fertility treatment, I just want to caution not to fall into a trap of just thinking about egg freezing potentially, or just thinking about IVF. And these are the most common. So with that established, just to give a sense for the cost then, and therefore what the financial burden would be for someone undergoing this at a private treatment, or at a private clinic, I should say. Clearly, the NHS is a fantastic resource that we have here in the UK. And absolutely, the NHS, there will be a number of people that will qualify for treatment under the NHS. I have another slide coming up, though, that will share why sometimes that ends up not really being a viable option for people, or maybe I shouldn't say viable, but practical option, either based on wait times or other exclusions. So putting that to the side for now, if someone has to undergo private treatment, this is just a slide that I wanted to share based on our partner clinics. And you'll see here that we work with a number of clinics that are in London, so 13 different clinics across London. But then we have relationships with 9 or more clinics outside of London here in the UK, where we thought we'd also give a sample size of the costs for treatment. What's interesting about this is, what people typically would expect is that costs are going to be more in London. And that is certainly the case for IVF. But actually, you'll see that for IUI and for egg freezing, it can be roughly the same, if not marginally more, outside of London as well. So again, if you are up outside of London and maybe up north or in one of the other regions of the UK, it's probably worth not taking for granted that treatment or supporting employees outside of London is going to cost significantly cheaper than, I guess, if you had a London office or a predominantly London-based employee group. And so here, as I mentioned, for outside of London, there's 9 different clinics that are represented here. The 3 different bars are reflecting IUI, egg freezing, and then IVF in that order. I'm sorry, it's not the same as the table that I've got in the upper right. So from IUI to egg freezing to IVF in terms of the costs. And you'll see the distribution across those outside of London as well as those in London. And you'll see, therefore, the average then for IUI within a London-based clinic is about £1,352. Outside of London, that would be more than £1,700. For IVF in London, it's just over £9,000 and just over £8,000 outside of London. And then an egg freezing cycle for both is roughly about £5,200 or £5,300. And so largely concentrated around these averages, but worth sharing that it's not necessarily always cheaper outside of London, or it's not necessarily always drastically more expensive even in London. So then, having said that, while you'll see that maybe a lot of headline points or even advertising or literature or brochures from clinics will say that the average cost of a single cycle of IVF is £5,000, you'll know that from the slide I just showed that actually our averages were slightly higher, so just over £5,000. What I want to call out here is that often that may or may not include investigations, or it may not include consultations, or it may not necessarily include all of the things that you might expect. And so here across the UK, it'll say the average cost of a single cycle is £5,000. But the point really is the second sentence, which is that patients on average pay more than £13,000, and with more than 1 in 10 paying more than £30,000 when they go through IVF. So clearly this would also reveal that many pursue more than one treatment cycle, or find that it is worth their while, or they feel that they will get the best outcome if they don't just limit themselves to one single cycle. But even so, you'll see that it's more than just 2x the £5,000. You'll see that there often are additional investigations or additional costs that might not be what an advertisement might describe as being within a typical IVF cycle. So we're talking about meaningful sums of money, especially considering what the national average wage is here in the UK. This therefore does pose a significant financial burden on people if they don't qualify, nor wait for, nor subsequently go through treatment or the NHS, or potentially they have, but they've exhausted maybe the number of cycles that they're eligible for at their local NHS trust, and so they're having to go private. So again, this is all based on the cost of private fertility treatment. We've already spoken about how so many individuals said that they weren't prepared for the financial burden before they started their treatment. Just mentioning here that nearly everybody says that they have experienced financial problems in relation to their, or worries of some concern related to the treatment. And the reason I'm reiterating this point is because as these individuals are your colleagues or your employees, your team members, and you're hoping that they're productive at work and in your workplace and bringing their best selves to work and available to bring their best selves, if 95% of them, when they're going through maybe fertility treatment, are actually experiencing financial difficulty, concerns, or have worries about that, clearly that's going to impact them as a colleague and in the workplace. And this is why we feel it's important to all of you. In addition, I've mentioned the headline numbers, the average costs, the sort of case studies of what you could expect, both within London and outside of London. More than 1/3 of adults actually, according to the FCA in the UK, do not have any savings at all, or a savings account, or if they do, they have less than £1,000 in their savings account. And clearly, given the numbers that I just showed you, that is not enough for them to undergo fertility treatment. And then whilst you would hope that some might save up towards that, or you would think that they could do, depending on the amount of time that it would take them to save up for that, considering their household expenses, cost of living and the like, it might be that they run out of time in order to save a sufficient amount of money to pursue the treatment cycle that they want. So therefore, these are all of the sort of not just consequences, but even the underlying reasons for why fertility treatment or seeking to become a parent can be such a burden on individuals, and why we'd hope, first of all, that an employer would look to try and support that in some way in order to increase productivity, and some other reasons that I'll talk about in a few minutes, but also why individuals or employees are going to associate that with their workplace because they think about that as their primary source of income, and because it could lead to frustration if they don't feel equipped to support it. So as I was just saying, this is maybe helping to crystallize why we think employers should care, or what the role of an employer is in supporting employees through fertility treatment. So clearly we believe that if you're supporting them financially in some way, and I'll talk about lots of different ways, it doesn't necessarily mean, I don't want to imply that we're suggesting all employers should consider paying for all of an employee's fertility treatment. That's not the case, and that's hopefully not going to be the takeaway from this session. But we're also pointing out that employers should care because there is an impact on the employee's well-being and their mental health. And so therefore, at least considering this, and we really appreciate, again, your attending, which obviously signals and self-selects and indicates that you're already part of this cohort. We're preaching to the converted at this degree. You'll recognize the impact on the employee's well-being and mental health. Also caring about this or considering some form of policy for fertility treatment will help to attract and retain talent. You know, you've seen, or I'll be able to share, there's other stats coming up about the number of, or you see on the right-hand side, you know, how many employees would care about whether or not there's some fertility support within a company. I think when we talk about millennials and you talk about Gen Z, you see some surveys reporting up to 90% of individuals who will take fertility benefits as a consideration when they consider a new job. Third point on here is about employee engagement. So if you've supported somebody with their well-being and they're in a better place, you're attracting better talent, you're clearly also going to benefit from greater employee engagement, because those that have their well-being supported are going to feel greater connection with their workplace, with their work, and be able to engage greater with their work tasks, their goals, their KPIs, their OKRs, and what they're helping and contributing and driving the business towards. Similarly, the fourth bullet point talks about improving workplace culture and inclusivity. Clearly, as we all sort of recognize now, the benefits of having diverse views, diverse pathways, diverse, backgrounds and experiences reflected in our work and in our collective deliverables. Being able to support individuals, say, for example, those who are married in a heterosexual relationship just as much as those who might be single and be considering their future options, or those that are LGBT, potentially in same-sex relationships and need support, being able to provide support for all of them in order to become parents, should they choose to, does obviously reflect and carry on or underscore a commitment to an inclusive workplace, and therefore improves the culture altogether. And then finally, very, very pragmatically and very commercially, reduces absenteeism. Because if you have support for individuals as they go through their fertility treatment and their journey, they are therefore less preoccupied. They are hopefully taking fewer days off or unaccounted absences in order to attend appointments. They potentially and hopefully feel like the workplace is a safe space to talk to their line manager about the fact that they may need to attend appointments. They're undergoing treatment, they're undergoing care. They'll feel the support that's available through the workplace for that. And so they'll be more open about when they'll have to book or schedule time or coordinate their meetings or other commitments around what they're undergoing. So as a sort of a catch-all, you know, our thesis to you and our thrust here is that by supporting employees through fertility treatment, you know, companies aren't just providing a benefit and something that's on a tick list or a checklist. You know, the employers will be fostering a culture of support, as I mentioned, inclusivity, encouraging well-being, that will ultimately result in long-term positive outcomes, clearly for the individual, we hope, and as the intention, but also for the company, because we're talking about individuals, but if you have a cohort, if you have even a few individuals that you're supporting at the same time, that is absolutely going to seep into the rest of the organization from that increased well-being, that increased engagement, that increased sort of positivity, and that sort of improved culture. So just a few points in terms of why we think it's important for employers to care. Now, it will be the case that I've already talked about the NHS, and many people might already also have private medical insurance coverage or PMI schemes available to their employees. However, we thought it was worth flagging that globally, so this is global, not UK specific, but more than half of group PMI policies will exclude fertility treatments. I'm not saying they'll exclude them all necessarily, but they will sort of, this is 67%, so it's far more than half, actually, almost close to 3/4. There will be some form of exclusion. So there might be coverage for egg freezing, for example, if a woman has undergone or had a cancer diagnosis, unfortunately. There might be support for IVF for the similar reason, for example. But what we would encourage, a fully inclusive and supportive organization would consider, is supporting fertility treatment for individuals who haven't had a medical diagnosis or medical reason to undergo it. So I think rather unpleasant choice of words, but private medical insurance providers or carriers will often describe egg freezing as social egg freezing or elective egg freezing, and clearly see it as a lifestyle choice for people to choose to freeze their eggs. We have enough studies now that show that the majority of women who freeze their eggs are not doing that necessarily to work harder, stay longer at the jobs, or because they feel pressure to work. It is simply because they have not yet felt they found their life partner, or are in a place to start a family, and they're being pragmatic and hopefully looking to try and maximize optionality, even though, of course, egg freezing is not a guaranteed or a foolproof route. It certainly does help to expand options in future. And so we're seeing that even though it's so heavily excluded from most PMI policies, it does make commercial sense to support that for employees. And then here, the second stat is just the fact that the exclusion rate is even greater, disproportionately greater here across Europe, of which the UK is being counted, and Asia, than it is in other parts of the world. So again, we're probably talking in the UK about even greater exclusions in PMI policies. And this is why, having already talked about the NHS as a potential challenge for people, or certainly not a solution for supporting employees. Again, this is why we wanted to cover the fact that most private medical insurance policies wouldn't actually be inclusive or comprehensive in supporting fertility treatment either. I also should mention that many won't cover those for individuals who are in a same-sex relationship, because many private medical insurance policies might actually require there to be a heterosexual married couple without children from a prior relationship, for example, and maybe even potentially legal marriage evidence. So continuing on with the private medical insurance, these are some of the exclusions, and I already alluded to, same-sex couples. There could be something relating to previous health diagnosis or indicators, whether that's smoking, weight, or otherwise, or the period of time where a couple may be trying to conceive naturally. Otherwise, we're also talking here about, then on the right-hand side, what else should be considered when the sort of temptation is to assume that insurance might cover everything. These are the points that get brought up to us about clients when they come to us, because I will tell you, almost 100% of our workplace clients do have private medical already in place for their employees before they start thinking about reproductive health as a sort of specific gap to address. And so even though there are PMI policies already in place at companies that we work with, they still look for the additional and not just the financial support, but the well-being support, or the financial, alleviating the financial burden through us as well. And so that does actually mean that there is a large enough gap, both in NHS provision availability and in private medical insurance. This then back to the NHS side, and I'm sorry, I should probably restructure these for saving them later, or if people ask for copies of the slides. Over on the right-hand side, and I'm sorry if it's really small on this slide, going through the countries, obviously the top sort of 2/3 of this is Europe, or the top half is European countries, obviously starting with the UK, and then the latter half is Asia, so may or may not be directly relevant, but you can see what the average wait lists are for undergoing fertility treatment at the NHS here in the UK, or through the public healthcare system in their respective country. And so nobody has anything less than a 3 to 6 month wait list. In the UK, it's presently up to 2 years, which, like I alluded to earlier, can really be quite consequential for individuals, depending on the age that they are when they already start on the wait list. So we've gone through NHS, we've gone through private medical insurance, and then I want to circle back a little bit to something else I'd said, which is, there I was alluding to the cost of an actual treatment cycle, but I want to remind that we're not just talking about that exclusively. There are lots of ways to support your employees through their fertility journeys. And I want to emphasize that it doesn't necessarily have to be budget intensive. And I mean binary here in this on-off kind of way, which is, it's not that there is some financial support or there's financial support and it's everything. So there's lots of different ways to do this. And of these four, I'll take the top row first. The first way would be clearly supporting your employees through their emotional and mental well-being. And like I said, half of our clients, slightly more than half, do some form of financial support, but close to half don't provide any kind of financial support, but what they have invested in, obviously at a cost to the company, is working with ourselves. So for TIFA, or clearly there are lots of other businesses across the UK that are working with another provider to support the employee, the emotional, the mental well-being. And doing this alone will certainly contribute to increased productivity and engagement and retention and all of the topics that I'd already mentioned. So that is universal to any of these 4 types of financial support. Actually offering the well-being support so that there are specialist advisors, not just a sort of a coverall EAP, for example, or even a GP on site, but somebody who understands fertility journeys or path to parenthood, understands perhaps the intricacies or the nuances and the legal considerations for surrogacy or for adoption, but also what options might be available for IVF, for example, specialist advisors and access to that for that independent advice, signposting, and navigational support is absolutely paramount and is worth so much value to individual employees, even if there's no actual cost then towards subsequent treatment. Similarly, that goes for, support while somebody's going through the NHS, because as we all know, in addition to the wait list, there's also a sort of quite a finite amount of time allocated to NHS appointments. So one might be supported by the NHS, one might be undergoing treatment, but one then might be limited to 20-minute appointments when they go see their consultant or a midwife, and they might have more questions that, again, a third-party wellbeing support provider can make available. Similarly, then outside of the NHS, there are going to be possibly referrals to private clinics that would be helpful, or at least comparing notes about those clinics, or comparing treatment clinical staff in order, again, to support the well-being of the employee. Staying on that top row now to the right, there's also the opportunity to make sure that your policies for paid time off would include potentially for treatment, appointments, consultations with respect to undergoing fertility treatment. So again, doesn't have to be paying for all of the treatment, but perhaps including within a policy, leave or potential time off, whether that's days off, half days off, even a couple of hours at a time for attending appointments or for scans, and the opportunity for them to rearrange their schedule around what they would typically have to do during a clinic's operating hours, which is overlapping, of course, during the business day, would be important. I also made a point here, which is investing in not just the paid time off, but in making sure that there are private spaces, maybe within the workplace, if it's not wholly remote, or even if it's just hybrid, but if there's a return to office policy in place, where somebody can not only store their medication, maybe in the refrigerator, but can also have privacy for maybe their injections. Very similar to the conversations about maybe lactation rooms or nursing rooms for new mums who have returned to work. It's very similar, where not only is it, really, really demoralizing to have to, nurse a little one in, say, the lavatory or the bathrooms or a stall. It's the same for having to make a hormone injection. And so being able to do that in a private room, whether that's, again, a quiet room for new mums, a prayer room, reflection, or otherwise, consider investing in that as well. And then on the bottom row, this is probably what we assume most people dialed in to think about, which is either direct financial support for either some of or all of treatment costs. It can be one or the other. It can be on a spectrum, for example, and this is my point, it's not binary, it's not all or nothing. It can, of course, be subject to exclusions if organizations want to put those in place, or sort of guardrails. It could potentially, for example, be applicable to employees after they pass probation, after there's a certain amount of tenure, maybe after a certain level of seniority, maybe only for domestic treatment or costs within the UK or their place of employment. Maybe it doesn't cover, storage, for example. Maybe it's only covering certain components or aspects. We have clients that will support the IVF or assisted reproductive technology, but they don't have the allowance then supporting surrogacy or adoption, just because they have questions about the legal implications or regulatory points because their workplace is further afield. For any reason at all, there can be exclusions. Of course, a company has the right to put those in place. They could put in clawbacks, for example, if an employee leaves within a certain period after being reimbursed, And there can be limits, of course. And I'll talk about some of the examples or the sort of a survey that we've done for benchmarking what those allowances can be. And then just to be comprehensive, and like I said, I'll have a few slides about this as well, specifically on what Fertifa can offer, but there's also the opportunity just to signpost and offer access to financing. So if a company doesn't necessarily want to budget towards paying even a portion of treatment costs, and again, we've had some of our workplace clients which will pay for the initial consultations or maybe the initial investigations, but then say the actual treatment cycle has to be self-funded by the employee. But if that's still not something that the employer wants to fund out of their budgets, you know, there is education that can be done around sort of credit cards or other forms of credit, such as buy now, pay later, which some UK banks are offering even in conjunction with a current account, for example. There are also third-party financing companies that can be signposted to an employee, such as probably the biggest in the UK is called Access Fertility, and it is just about financing for IVF, for example, or assisted reproductive technology. And then mentioning here as a third point, there's also signposting or making available to your workplace a Fertifa payment plan. And this is something that requires, aside from paying for the access to the payment plan, doesn't require any budget from the company to support the treatment cycle. It's paid for upfront by us here at Fertifa. We take on that financial risk or that exposure. We take on the repayments from the employees. Again, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but it's another option for offering access to employees to a program such as the Fertifa payment plan or Access Fertility or buy now, pay later or other types of credit, which companies can have a role in providing that signposting or that access to. And somebody has asked a question, which I appreciate, because I said I was inviting and I'd be grateful for questions, but I'm just going to mention it out loud in case they wanted it in context to the previous slide, which is when I think it first popped up, or even this slide. The question was whether this covers fertility programs in the UK only, and what if an employee wanted to go to Europe for fertility treatment? I'm not clear, so I just want to make sure I answer the question appropriately. If the question is specifically about the Fertifa payment plan, and if it is for UK treatment only at the moment. Of course, that is a sort of a guideline that's been put in place by us here at Fertifa as we roll this payment plan out. It could be subject to change and expanding in future, which we absolutely hope to do. But initially, we're applying it, yes, to UK fertility treatment cycles. But again, I have some more slides on that coming in future. And thanks for confirming. So hopefully I've answered the question then appropriately or helpfully, but feel free to keep asking more as I go through more slides about the Fertifa payment plan. So these are just some points about not offering, and you'll see that I stole this slide from another webinar that we had done last summer. Again, more statistics that I'm sharing about employees considering leaving their job or potentially rejecting a job without the fertility benefits in place. So here's then the benchmarking I alluded to and company policies that we've found and that we've sort of surveyed. I'm just comparing here on the left, the UK sort of benchmarking that we've done alongside the US, because we do find that I think US companies were probably faster to pick up this benefit or to provide it to their colleagues, or that a lot of UK companies and employers, and certainly our workplace clients here, started introducing it because they might be either part of a US topco or a headquartered based company, or that they have a US office which introduced it, and that's what prompted them to do it in the UK as well. Either way, we thought it was an interesting exercise to show full size, or just to show side by side. We'll say that I actually realize now I have an error, so I will change that before we share these slides, but I'll say it and I'll emphasize it really heavily instead of pretending I don't see it. That I see that I have a copy paste error, and I'm sorry. The bold points about the lower quartile, median, and upper quartile for US is clearly just a copy paste from the UK side. So I'm sorry for that. I will change that before we send slides out if people request them. But you'll see that the unbolded commentary and of course the graphs underneath do reflect the differences between the UK and the US. Here in the UK, company policies range from £1,000 to £50,000. And we would say a typical policy, or the average policy, certainly for a larger corporate, not necessarily SMEs, is about a £15,000 lifetime allowance. In contrast, we see in the US that can range from about $5,000 to $75,000. and we'll see an average of about 25,000 for a lifetime allowance. And again, apologies, I will update the lower quartile, median, and upper quartile for the US figures when we share the slides. So to go then into how you can support through the payment plan, and I do probably have a few more slides than maybe you want at this point, but again, if people have questions, let me know. So I'll go through them quickly. They're included here as a resource so that you can review this back later or when you go through the slides. But with the Fertifa payment plan, just to mention it again, it's something that we undertake as in terms of a contract in effect or an agreement between Fertifa, ourselves, and the employee. So the company, the workplace does pay for, and we do have workplace clients of ours that do this already. They not only pay us for the well-being support and the navigational advice, obviously, that we provide to their employees and all the educational access and the webinars and the things that are part of our sort of more standard offering, but they pay for, an enhanced program, which includes access to the payment plan. So the employer would pay an enhanced fee for access to the payment plan, whereby every one of their employees, therefore, is potentially eligible to apply. They can certainly apply then to the payment plan. However, acceptance or agreement into a payment plan does have to be subject to eligibility and affordability. So I should say really upfront, really clear, we are not guaranteeing or assuring that every single person within your organization would be eligible for the payment plan, but every single person we would encourage certainly to apply, and we would assess and evaluate their affordability and their eligibility. I think that any workplace would be aligned with us in suggesting that it's really important that we do check affordability, and we make sure that by offering a payment plan, which is meant to help alleviate some of the financial burden, we don't actually inadvertently thrust somebody or move somebody more towards any additional financial burden or any kind of debt that would be potentially unmanageable. So again, a workplace would pay for Fertifa for their employees to have access to the payment plan. If an employer had the payment plan and had signed up to that enhanced program where the payment plan is available to employees, what happens is that for employees who are looking to avoid having to pay out of pocket up front, which would be the case maybe with any buy now, pay later, which I'd mentioned briefly, for example, or even for employer reimbursement subsequently. It's always the case in those examples that employee will have to pay out of pocket up front initially, and then submit their invoices, for example, to us to get reimbursed. Even if somebody has a great £50,000 lifetime allowance, if it's a reimbursement benefit, it means the employee is going to have the money up front available to pay the invoice in the first instance. For the payment plan, what happens is if the employee passes the affordability and eligibility checks that we will check, they will then have the treatment paid for upfront by us at Fertifa to a UK clinic. We will pay for that treatment plan upfront, and then we will work in conjunction with the employer to make sure that we are paid then over the subsequent 12 months back in 12 installments as a result of salary deduction post-tax. This payment back to us, by the way, is interest-free, and it is also fee-free. So the amount that's paid for the treatment cycle, you saw that on some of the numbers, let's say it's £7,200, £7,218, for example, Fertifa would pay the £7,218 to the clinic up front. Fertifa would get paid back £7,218 from the employee over the next 12 months in equal payments. We do not charge interest or any additional fees to the employee. Again, our business model, our margin where we're getting compensated is based on the program fee that the company has paid us for the employees to have access to the payment plan. And so I'm just looking at the question that's come in, and somebody has kindly offered, I think key to the decision on this is the cost for the employer and how does it work? Does the employer pay only when the employee requests access? So yeah, sorry, no, I'll try and be clear in how to say it again. No, similar to our underlying program benefit, which is the well-being support and navigational advice, employers pay us for employees to have access, all employees to have access to all of Fertifa's resources and the support that we provide, whether that's the well-being support, whether it's navigational support, and in this case, whether it's the financial support. So we will quote you an amount that we would charge for the company to have access to the payment plan. And then that's it. There's nothing extra paid then when people do come through the payment plan or when people are eligible. So therefore we are forecasting or we are looking at predicting based on the company's demographics, how many people might apply for the payment plan, how many people might ultimately be eligible, and therefore what that sort of cost of that capital would be. Again, we're not charging interest and we're not charging fees to the employee. So we're looking to make sure that we are made whole by making the money available, by basically, it's not quite a float because we have paid the monies to the clinic, but by allowing the employee to pay it back to us over 12 months rather than having to pay upfront. And so if you're interested in a quote, clearly, please get in touch and we'll be able to scope that for you based on your employer size and some very, very high level demographics. Moving on though, and maybe other questions will be answered in the subsequent slides. So in terms of how it works for the payment plan, it's very similar in terms of getting support from us as it would be for wellbeing support. It always starts with Fertifa through our app. It always starts with booking in a discovery call and speaking to your dedicated advisor. For the payment plan specifically, the employee would be asked to fill out not quite a credit application, but similarly an eligibility assessment, which will do a soft credit check only. So it will not impact an employee's credit score or credit rating, but we will be asking for their income, their salary, any mortgage payments, any rent payments, any ongoing monthly commitments that they have, so that we can make sure out of a duty of care that if we do have them go through the payment plan, the repayments that they'll ultimately pay to us won't put them into any other financial difficulty. We will then talk through whether or not they're eligible or not for the Fertifa payment plan, what the monthly deductions would be. Again, these are post-tax. And so that the employee would be very clear about that and understand it. We'd make sure that we are fully documented. We do sign an agreement then with the employee directly relating to the payment plan. In full transparency, we cover, of course, the risk if the employee were to leave the company during the 12 months of repayment. But because of that reason, we also ask them to sign up to a direct debit mandate that we would automatically switch over to if they left the company. Again, this would be no risk to the company at all, even if they left. And the fundamental point is that there's no out-of-pocket upfront payment then for the employer before they undergo treatment. And in theory, and what we're pushing, which is why there's the duty of care, which is why we look at eligibility and affordability, and which is why we cannot guarantee that every employee is necessarily going to be eligible, but that there's peace of mind for them to be able to pay for their treatment costs spread out over 12 months, rather than having to save up to pay that all at once. At the moment, and maybe I should have alluded to this when I read the question out loud, but what's presently included, and again, this is a Fertifa program, we're not white labeling or simply repackaging a program from another provider. And so we can, this is subject to change, and we would hope and we would like, and we can increase this or expand this offering over time. The moment we're making it available for all reproductive health treatments and health assessments that are offered by Fertifa. We also have it covered neurodiversity as well. So I mentioned at the top of the webinar, you know, we're here talking about fertility, but if somebody has menopause, for example, well-being support from us, we would also include that as well. And the Fertifa nurse and doctor consultations, that would be for any Fertifa services on reproductive health or neurodiversity. At the moment, we would exclude, so we won't have this cover health assessments or investigations at external clinics or any add-ons after treatment. Really what we're focusing on is a full treatment cycle if we're talking about a third-party clinic treatment cycle. We're also not covering storage at the moment, simply because that's typically a year at a time or even multiple years in a package at once. And since repayment back to us is over 12 months, doesn't seem necessarily viable or helpful. And we aren't covering additional medication either. Part of the reason for that is not necessarily everyone uses all of their medication. It becomes a little bit more complicated, whereas we know exactly what's included in the invoice for an actual treatment cycle, whether that's egg freezing, sperm freezing, IVF, IUI, for example. And so we're happy to cover that through the Fertifa payment plan. Final slide on just the payment plan, and I'll go back to sort of generalizations again. Questions about this, and again, I appreciate somebody had already mentioned this in the chat or asked it, which I've answered. Right now, this is offered to any company who signed up to the Fertifa payment plan for all their employees to be able to at least apply, and we would check affordability and eligibility. We wouldn't have it exceed the cost of a treatment cycle. Obviously, we would be privy to that invoice because we'd be making payment on that, and in no doubt or in no scenario would we make it for more than a £12,000 payment at once. You can do the maths. We think, you know, £1,000 repayment each month is probably quite a lot to bear, even for, you know, highest salaries. And so we've limited it to £12,000 a year, or the cost of a single treatment cycle or single assessment or consultation. It is over salary deductions post-tax over 12 months, only for UK residents, UK bank account holders as well. And applicants must be able to prove that they live and work in the UK. Again, this is through our workplace clients, and so we would potentially be able to verify and check that with the employer as well. And repayments are during payroll. So we would take the repayments which are forwarded on to us from the company that's taking that from the paychecks or payroll. And once an employee has submitted an application or is interested in applying for the fertility payment plan, we would take 5 to 10 business days in order to assess their eligibility and to let them know whether or not they could participate or enter into a payment plan agreement. So, and I'm mindful of the time. I know I started a couple of minutes late, but it's already 54 minutes after the hour. And I typically like to give people at least a couple of minutes before maybe a next call that you've got scheduled in. But just to recap briefly, we do think, obviously here at Fertifo, our raison d'etre and the reason that we're here, and hopefully a potential partner for you, if not already your partner, we're here to look after your employees' well-being and their reproductive health. There are lots of ways you can do that. There are some examples in the boxes below. Obviously, everything we've been talking about today was centered around financial support. I have hopefully emphasized that it doesn't mean that you have to do everything. It's not sort of a takes all or nothing kind of a program. Even offering some paid time off, even offering the well-being support and investing in that goes a long way. And like I said, about half of our clients have invested to that degree, which is offering our well-being support and navigational advice. But slightly more than half have also gone further to support, whether it's £1,000 a year or £50,000 across an employee's lifetime employment at a company, to pay towards some or all the treatment costs. It could also be a cost sharing, for example. Some companies say that they'll pay up to 50%, up to a certain amount. Some people say that they'll pay for, like I said, just the treatment cycle. Some will say just the investigations. It's really up to you. And here at Fertifa, we're really, really happy to help you benchmark what happens in your sector or maybe across competitors with whom you compete for talent. And we're happy to help you put in place a policy that makes sense for you and for which you can get feasible budget. We're here to do that for you through the sort of the period where we consult on whether or not the well-being support's of interest, but now also, of course, on the financial services side as well. And of course, we're still here to do the reimbursements. Like I said, we've done more than £5 million of reimbursements of employers' own policies. I should mention that maybe an even more impressive stat than that £5 million worth of reimbursements, which companies are paying for, is the fact that we've pulled out more than £400,000 worth of ineligible claims. And so in that regard, not only are we protecting a patient's confidentiality by handling the claims review and the claims admin, we're actually working a lot and working really hard for your compliance as an employer to make sure that it's not just that we're pushing paper from one side to the other and getting a receipt and saying, now you have to pay this back. We're actually looking at the eligibility of the claims. We're making sure that they fall within the scope of your policy. I mentioned you can have as many exclusions as you'd want, or you can restrict it to certain types of treatment or in certain places. And so when we do reimbursement administration, we do ensure compliance, and we have picked up duplicate invoices. We have picked up, unfortunately, fraudulent invoices. We have picked up medications that shouldn't have been included, or we picked up out-of-country treatment if the company wasn't wanting to fund that, for example. So out of the more than £5 million worth of reimbursement claims that we have processed in the last couple of years, we've pulled out more than £400,000 worth of ineligible claims. So that's on the reimbursement side. And again, of course, the payment plan is now available for companies that are not looking or in a position to reimburse. But even before that, I've hopefully conveyed to you or convinced you that there are even other steps you can take in terms of investing in the well-being support, the paid time off, a safe place or a private place for people to have their injections or to store their medication, for example, and just to be able to have the conversation and bring their best selves to work. So with that, those are all of the slides I prepared. I do really appreciate and I'm so grateful for the questions that came in along the way. I apologize for rambling on a bit more than I'd anticipated, which has left me a little bit short of time if I want to give you back time of the hour. There is another poll that I wanted to actually end the session on, which is just roughly about feedback. If you are so inclined to help give us feedback on this, I'd be really grateful for any thoughts. And I will also share in the chat, so before people start going off, hopefully, some signposting of some of the resources that we have on our website in support of financial allowances and financial support. So thanks so much for those of you who have responded to the survey already. I will try and do this. It might be a bit awkward if it's the last 60 seconds of the webinar, where I'm going to look to get copy and paste for you in the chat some of the resources that we have on our website. We're clearly here and available to have calls with anybody if you want to have conversations about even underlying educational awareness, HR training, line manager training, and resources we make available to that for reproductive health topics. But of course, if it's anything specific on financial services and financial support as well, hopefully through this session, you understand that we're really here to support you with that as well as a workplace. So thank you very much for joining me today. Sorry, again, I started a minute or two late and I've gone right up to the hour. It's 59 minutes after. And so for those of you who have calls next, or if you're watching this back later, you might need to rush off to your next call. But I am really, really grateful for your participation, for your engagement, for responding to the polls, and obviously for the questions that came along the way. Hope that it's been helpful and that we'll be able to talk with you very soon. Thanks so much and all the best, everybody. Take care.